Buonasera.
Good evening, everybody. So here tonight you have the worst moderator of history. What are we talking about this evening? We're going to talk about novels. I think that all of us, or at least the elder ones amongst us, we think that words, thoughts, characters, we talk about them in novels. The great novels from The Betrothed, Les Miserables, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Flaubert, Balzac. We could mention many different ones. In some way, they have all marked our education. They have tried to form, shape our culture, shape the way that we enter our world. It's an introduction to the world. And novels have introduced us to our world, have accompanied us into this introduction into the world. We will ask ourselves a couple of questions regarding whether novels are still at the center of that world that we call literature. If the questions that novels have spoken of, have these questions been entrusted to other means of communication? And what would we need if we were to not write novels anymore? These are legitimate questions that come to people who write, to authors of novels, people who write novels, people who are in the field of literature, people who read literature, and who constantly look for something new. For this reason, I have invited a couple of friends. People who I'm very curious to know what they have to say about this topic. Gian Mario Villalta, our first guest, who is not only an author. We have grown up together, and we have also written about similar things. He's also a poet, however. He has written poems both in Italian and in the Friulan dialect. And he has studied many important poets like Andrea Zanzotto. And he has worked at the Pordenonelegge, one of the most important literary festivals, I think, in Italy. So I wanted to ask Gian Mario to come And this Pordenonelegge, this festival, is an observatory for literary movements today. Our second guest, Carmen Pellegrino, and she was a finalist at the Campiello competition. She has written 2 books. They're very beautiful. She's also an anthropologist. She's an abandonologist. I thought this was a word invented by Vittorio Sgarbi. Anyway, she looks after places that have been abandoned. And at my right, I have Marco Pisoni, who is a great reader of novels, but he himself has to do with, he occupies himself with screenwriting. He's with TV series. To adapt a novel to the screen, we have to understand novels very well and have strong reasons for adapting them. So before giving the floor to our friends, I'd like to show you 3 brief contributions of other 3 friends who are not here today. The first one is Massimo Onofri. He's a literary critic. Alessandro Baricco. So some of you might know him. He's a founder and director of the Holden School. And then our third video is Sergio Givone, a philosopher. So I would start with Massimo Onofri. What is the future of novels? I would say, but we are talking about a crisis of novels for decades by now. The novel starts by contemplating its own crisis, actually. Novels have gotten to their highest point with Philip Roth. We could say with Philip Roth, and in Italy with Elsa Morante. With the death of Philip Roth, we have a certain type of narration, that euphoric narration. And this type of narration comes to an end with the death of Philip Roth. As you can see, these are very brief contributions. Alessandro Baricco. So what you have basically is a product that constantly improves itself, but tends to decentralize itself from its main objective. We're not talking about a decline or an apocalypse of the genre, because novels have brought the meaning of life to people. When novels arrived, Western society found it a very suitable genre to collect the vibration of the meaning of life. And this is what we mean by the triumph of the genre of novels in the 18th century. Now this is not the case anymore. So human beings identify themselves with other types of genres. Popular music, pop music, And with the digital revolution, everything has changed again, and an explosion has happened towards a multiplication of meaning, of different types of meaning. And the speed, the rapidity of communication is contrasts with the concentration and the patience that is needed for a novel. The idea of mobility, the necessity for moving, is now makes a novel less current in our society. And our last contribution is Sergio Givone. What do novels and TV series have in common? I would say nothing and everything at the same time. Everything, because both have a narration that develops a plot. In the case of novels, there is a beginning and an end. As great critics of novels said, there's an exodus and an ostos. There's a departure and a return home. Whereas in TV series, we don't have either. There's no beginning, there's no end, but everything starts again. There's a continuous starting again. We don't know what beginning and end are anymore. The idea of departing from home and going back home is unknown to us anymore. We are now a society of TV series. This is the genre that defines us. This doesn't mean that novels aren't for us anymore, or that can't serve us. But now it's not like we're exiled in a certain sense, but we need to know what it means to come back home, to return home. If this need stays, if this need continues, we won't find a novel slipped in or snuck in between a TV series and another. While I listened to Sergio Givone, who spoke about not going back home and a non-return towards home, and the idea of a departure, a lot of very painful things of our time come to mind. Many painful struggles that bring the question for meaning emerge. Within this sea of different types of narration, these many stories, an ocean of stories that come through social media, these contradictory voices that come to us through advertising, TV series, even through video games that are a secondary source of information, I think. They tell stories to us. But in these times that are tragic, we have this question for meaning. The same question that moved Alessandro Manzoni, Dostoevsky, Lev Tolstoy. So the first question I would like to pose to Gian Mario and Marco and Carmen: can novels still be something that can help us to reclaim this meaning? Can novels exist the way they used to exist in the past? as Massimo Onofri put it, can they carry the meaning of life? So I'd like to go back to cynicism, the process that from the 1600s to our globalized era with new science and new technology, this double process has also to do with social phenomena, existential political phenomena that have to do with the search for a subjectivity of a person, of people, and the idea of trying to reach as many people as possible. And this has never happened before in history. So we have the idea of the masses and the market, which affect this situation. We have the interests of politics using literature as an instrument of education and making it an instrument of its education, instrumentalizing it. And as we go towards the 19th century, we see how this is very prominent. And Manzoni shows us the opinion of those who were popular, of the popular opinion, and the poets would contrast to this popular class. But of course, they become at the center of certain literary works. This popular opinion becomes at the center of literary works during this time. The problem of our contemporary era is for literature to be pure, it has to be somehow divorced from advertising, from this market interest. Certain types of advertising have an extreme appeal, and it is extremely interesting and appealing how certain things can be sold to us, but at the same time, the word literature has to somehow remain separate to this, separate from this. Art has to do with existence and not communication. Just like language has to do with existence and not communication. So it's not that difficult to... sometimes we misunderstand each other. That happens quite often. But as we saw yesterday with Moro, language is quite complex. It's the foundation of existence. And I would say art is the foundation of existence. And it takes shape according to our relationship with the world. And something that we don't talk about enough is the form, not just of novels, but of what content is even allowed to appear in our media. We could say from Laud laud and collaude. So we have praise and applause. So what is happening is that those who know who are able to write very, very well now everybody is able to write very well. Somebody who writes a blog and those who write books. Now our way of writing has improved across genres. We have this new dimension whereby the linearity of time has sort of dissipated. Peter Slaughter talks about spheres or bubbles. We're at the center of something that has multiple dimensions, which does not have a linearity of time, a linear time. What comes to mind is a sentence by Mark Strand, which I think is incredible. Regarding his characters, they know that they will die, but not that the story will end. He says this over and over. The characters of this book know that they will die, but not that their story will end. And in this we have the foundation of all this. Aristotle had already, and I think he judged something by its ending. He would start from the ending. And this is what brought us to our way of seeing things, which is more tragic, because we tend to look towards ourselves in the present. And this is what we are losing. It's a sense of multicultural and accumulation of solutions and resources, a game within which the meaning and the sense of tragedy, the sense of tragedy of life as a beginning and an end is starting to wane and not be as present anymore in our minds. Sorry, Gian Mario, I'd like to go back to something that you said about your grandmother. Very briefly. A film can be judged by its ending. This is a very interesting point. We should become curious. In order to become curious about a movie, we have to be engaged in the plot. I remember a famous director who said, when I read a book, I don't remember how it's made. I just remember the structure. So I would read a half of it or a quarter of it, and I would realize that I knew how it was made in general, how it was structured. So this is going to be a good book, but I already know what's going to happen. But this is really interesting. The sense of the structure and knowing what happens is the substance. Because aesthetics is not just saying, oh, this is beautiful, I like it, I don't like it. It's how I can become one with my perception and the dialectic of perception with what I am reading or seeing. So, Marco, this is a really interesting question considering your profession. My father used to say, every time you start a book, you must bring it to its end. You must finish it. So I would always buy those vinyl discs, and I would listen to them from the beginning to the end because I was afraid of damaging them. So it's interesting how this media was actually made to be listened to from the beginning to the end. And now with MP3s and many different ways of listening to music that we have, this is not the case anymore. So from this point of view, the passion for a story, for a beginning and an end, becoming attached to characters, hasn't it been sort of a bit destroyed? How, in the same way that it has happened to us in music? We have kind of lost the idea of how things should end. Not only do in TV series are we interested in how they end, but we would prefer if they didn't end.
So good evening everyone, first of all, and it's a very interesting concept and it's not far from what I've been dealing with. So to understand, I don't think that's true as for what in as much to TV series. We don't want them to come to an end, but they do end and they have different ways of ending it for themselves. It's important to understand what's the main figure in these series that now it doesn't have many, doesn't make sense to call only for TV because it passes through a lot more media. When it comes to cinema, which we're all quite used to now, you know, films, otherwise, we're used to associate them with a director, and TV series are usually associated with a central person who rarely becomes as famous as a director called a showrunner. They don't take much a role in the visual aspects, the audio and video part, but only and exclusively on the narrative. They write a few episodes of the whole series, not normally the whole thing at a time, and they make sure that it maintains a narrative coherence from the beginning until the end. And I think this is very important because it puts the TV series in a privileged position to when faced with films, and similar to novels, because Kubrick, who's one of the most famous directors in the world, has adapted almost all of his films from novels, said that some excellent novels would be some terrible films. Or some mediocre novels have become some excellent films because of the way they've been made visually. For TV, it doesn't work the same way. Firstly, TV has a far smaller visual impact than cinema screens. And secondly, because TV series have a far longer duration compared to films. So to tackle boredom that we're often used to put up with, those 2 hours of Barry Lyndon in cinema, we wouldn't want to put up for 12 or 13 hours in our own homes. The relationship between novels and TV series, in my opinion, is something a little different. It has some interesting aspects, and to understand them properly, there's one or two stories that I think through which we can see not only what's the past and the future of the relationship between these two media forms. The first story is, in 1993 came J. Michael Straczynski, who is a showrunner, exactly, but even who wrote novels and an author, has made Babylon 5 a sci-fi series, which is possibly one of the first series to ever be completely written in its entirety by only one person. And he calls it a novel for TV. This will have a certain influence over what would happen in the 2000s, when TV series became, in inverted commas, for adults. It's something that happens starting in America with HBO, with Showtime, AMC, and many others. And it's the era of The Sopranos, of 6 Feet Under, of Mad Men, of Lost. Some series that now first have kind of opened up the debate on the value of these TV series, and if they're worth more than those that had come before them. So Straczynski writes all of Babylon 5. Sometime later, Nick Bizzolato, a novel writer who'd written a book called Galveston, a short one that had almost passed completely unnoticed by the public. So with HBO, he makes another series, which even that, he writes it all by himself and has a single director for the whole thing called True Detective. And the first series was another small revolution for TV media, written by a single person from the first to the last episode, all the way through. A few years before, another novel writer, Joel Dicker, author of The Truth of the Case of Berwick and Dicker, who eventually would become a TV series itself, he thought that his novel, after having seen the series Homeland, or at the end of every episode, something happened which made you want to watch the next episode. Every chapter of his book had to make you want to read the next one. It's not important whether he managed more or less. It's important to think that a writer had imagined a novel as if it was a TV series. The language of TV series for the first time was influencing the language of literature. The last example, a few years ago, Amazon Prime spent about $150 million to buy the rights of The Lord of the Rings to make a TV series, which should come out next year, I think. So we all know The Lord of the Rings. Most of the people who know it in the world know it through the Peter Jackson's trilogy of films in the early 2000s. But it's a book that was written in the 60s, a long time before that film, especially. And it starts to have its own traction. And it's a book that we'll see in the future. But it's not only just a book, it's become something else, and something that TV is taking principally from literature, but also from itself, from cinema, from other things. And it's becoming a kind of intellectual property, something that people recognize and they know, and that they already know and love, and on which they can build some new kinds of narration. TV narration stems from the literary one in order to create something new in the future. In my opinion, this is some of the most important points in the relationship between TV series and literature. And I think all of them almost at all time have had an ending. I don't think this relationship will have an end. I don't think TV series will grow without novels. I think they need them, in fact. Nor, on the other hand, will the novel go to become the only source of inspiration for TV series. Thank you. Carmen, you are interested as well, because between all of us except Marco, and even the three who spoke on video, you're the youngest. You belong to another generation than us. And because of this, I want to know, at the end, we've seen we've heard from old people, the three who spoke on video. And how do you see this, even narratively, the relationship with your generation, which is also a narrative that's based heavily around social media? I don't use them a lot at all myself, but for your generation, they use them a lot. So they have another kind of relationship. I don't know what blogs are, for example. I always seem to kind of lose track of when I try to inform myself about this modern technology. Should show you just how old I am. And I want to know, let's say, in your generation, for you, we're not generations, we're people. For you personally, how do you experience this problem in your work? So, good evening, everyone, first of all. All this stuff about youth, even I come from the last century, from the millennium before. I was born in 1976, so it's not like I'm all that young, like you say. I'm definitely not a millennial by any means. I grew up with the same kind of categories of stuff. Well, you're only 21 years younger than me. So I grew up in a time when there was still no internet, even me. The first phone came from kind of 96, 97, and 96, 97, I was already 18, 19. So you spoke about TV series quite rightly, and at the beginning and their ends, and everything's possible in the sense that you can have, we spoke about one evening, a vision of a whole season or multiple seasons of a series, and to quench your own curiosity in a day, in a night. I remember in my day, I didn't know how Candy Candy ended, the last episode. I was left with that, with this trouble myself. I missed the last few episodes when I was younger, and there was no way of rewatching them. And I discovered that later when I got access to the internet and things were put online. I managed to see them in the end. So the question of novels, I write novels myself, and obviously it's a genre of human expression and of human experience, which in this moment isn't going very well. It comes to mind that something Arbacino wrote in the 60s in certain novels. He says that the traditional novel died in 81 after the Brothers Karamazov, but someone had already understood something at that point, but they hadn't really said anything. So the problem with novels is the death, if it's still alive, they're still active, these novels. It's a question of, there's sometimes a issue of north-south divide. But we continue to publish and write and make novels. So I think there are two main questions we should approach here in the next couple of minutes. So the conflict between the new, quicker forms of media. You be talking about social networking, posts. I use Facebook a lot myself. And already, for example, on Instagram, I've got some issues, and on TikTok, let's not talk about that at all. I've no idea how it works. It belongs to another generation. Instagram is just pictures with a few words, and Facebook allows you to write a little longer than that. So what's the consequence of this kind of narration? It's that the reader, so the person the post is aimed at eventually, who are what are called Facebook friends on that site, they have a certain attention span that's very low. So you know that if you write a post that's too long, chances are that half the people who read it won't get to the end of the post. This has effects also in literature. People don't give themselves the time to dedicate to reading, time to sit down and read, even just time for imagination. Something happens. You were talking about this about languages, about structure and the importance of language. in the language in which something happens, the reader enters his own experience and something happens. There's an impact between the reader and the narrator and the writer that produces certain effects and can produce these effects still now if we let it do so. The point is that there isn't time anymore. I think this is the big issue right now, is that it's almost as if the reader didn't have any time, and even news articles online, they give you the time it takes to read them. It'll take you 5 minutes, it'll take you 3 minutes, and already above 5 the readers get a bit worried. What's more interesting is to see, where does this start? What's the cause and what's the effect of this? If it's a consequence of editing choices, because editors in some way push people, push the way novels are written. So before, more than in the past, editors now say, I want a story that goes from A to B to C with a linear structure, possibly with a happy ending, possibly that there wouldn't be too much pain in the middle of the writing. It's happened to me before. To me, an editor has asked me to take out a particularly painful section of a book in which I was talking about a particular horrible fight between people, and he asked me to take it out because to not oppress the reader was what he told me. And this is another thing. The reader doesn't want to be oppressed. If we look at Russian novels, we talk about Russian endings that end well. No, even their films, we call, what's it called, a Russian ending. We know they don't end well. But whole generations grew up reading those Russian novels, and no one felt oppressed by that. No one felt bad after reading those novels, particularly. So can we go without novels? Let's say, is to kind of answer the question we are putting ourselves now, we've been making for a long time now, like you said. I don't know. I still believe that art, which Gian Mario was talking about, without art, life becomes poorer. Art doesn't only imitate, it shouldn't really just imitate reality. It should recreate reality, invent reality. Let's think about us at Rimini here. Let's think about a Fellini film, La Dolce Vita. How does he imagine Via Veneto in that film? Not exactly as it is. It's not flat Via Veneto, it's an incline. But in the film, he makes us imagine as if it were flat. And that's augmented reality. Art does this. It gives us the possibility to know reality and something else in a different way, something imaginary. Can we go without this? Can we go without imagination? Perhaps in this idea of the realism of novels comes through. We want novels that tells us a story that give a timeline. That's not the point of art. The point of literature. The idea is to put before us how single people behave, how they react faced with destiny, with the weight of the world. And I'll just stop here. Let's look at Tolstoy, Ivan Ilyich, the death of Ivan Ilyich. In the first page, Tolstoy, what does he do? He tells us about the friend of a dead person who goes home to give homage to the person, and in front of the widow who tells him about the terrible sufferings of Ivan Ilyich before dying. What does this friend do? He has a moment of terror, but after a bit, Tolstoy tells us, this same idea that it happened to him and not to Ivan Ilyich, not to him, reassures him. When Tolstoy says the same idea, what's he doing? He's putting before us human nature. We need this. I think we'll always need this. And we'll always have need of it in future, no matter what. So I started first talking about friendship. Talking about friendship in what sense? That as something that comes through language. And it's the possibility that some distant destinies become closer suddenly. So I always thought that, for example, writing a book was like putting a message in a bottle, a message that can be read only by, and poetry even more so, Gian Mario said, at least on my behalf, only read by he who decides to absorb the density of those words, who sometimes, even if they only take out of it a word or a single phrase, is what they can receive properly. Because when Manzoni says, think about all those readers, who knows if between 100,000 readers there are only just 25 who accomplish this action of absorbing the writing properly, and there's something extraordinary that happens through the word. And it's what happens to me when, for the first time, I bought a book with my own money. I was a young kid, maybe 13, 14, maybe even less. I loved rock music. I bought On the Road by Kerouac, and I had a lot of books at home, and my dad always made me read lots. And On the Road is a book that I wasn't able to read it in the end because it's very rhetorical, it's difficult. It's a lot of long words and difficult structure. But in that moment there, I had the impression that this Kerouac, who I didn't know he'd already died a long time ago, and he was even older than my dad. I'd got the impression that he himself was talking to me directly in that moment. And the extraordinary thing about literature is this friendship that extends itself. And that I don't think it only comes through images. I don't know if that comes through properly. I'm not sure, but I have this doubt because, we sometimes say this can't happen until the moment, and then eventually it does happen. So ideas change it. So I want to know from you the final question quickly. If a novel's disappeared, if they stopped, this reflection on destiny, this desire to recount these stories about people who face destiny, knowing maybe already that they're going to be defeated, or they won't manage, or that we know already that they won't make it. So if this wasn't there anymore and we continued to have all the rest, what would we be missing? What would we lose? What would human experience lose out if this happened?
As Leonardo said before, images are more powerful than words because images can be seen in an instant. But while you are reading something out or making a speech, you must compose everything in your brain and keep account of everything that's been said. It's more complex. So the centrality of literature, as Marco said, literature gives to humanity the written word that has become the art of the written word. And what's happening in the last 15 or 20 years, maybe has begun even before then, what's happening is a loss of the centrality of the literary system. And the center of this literary tradition, at the center of it was precisely novels. This depends on the ability of writing, but also on our ability to read. It is the way in which we are able to read and imagine and comprehend the complexity of a world. This will transform us, of course, maybe for the better. It could be possible that a world built on images and the literature that is becoming more and more audio and visual. It might be a change for the better. And I'm optimist. So do you think, Gian Mario, do you agree with what Harold Bloom said, that reading a lot systematically and even with a little bit of struggle makes us more free? Do you agree with this? Yes, I think that reading is definitely an exercise that helps us to understand the world, and it increases our comprehension of reality in the world. But this is what I think. Everybody thinks that perhaps their own profession is the most important. Of course, I'm a writer, so this is what I think is the most important thing. But apart from this, the rapidity with which our media revolves around now, we'll see what the consequences are with time. I'm sure that the relationship with literature, however, will never end. It will continue to use literature as a resource. But of course, literature will now have a new role to play in our culture. Marco, I'll be even more brief. It is true that the novel has lost its centrality in our culture, in our world, but it is very central for those who create stories, for directors, for screenwriters. Novels are essential for these people. I think that one of the worst examples of screenwriting that we saw in Game of Thrones, the way that it was ended was not to base the ending of this TV series on Martin's novels. So I'm very sure that all those who create images would have a detrimental effect on them if they stopped having this relationship with novels and literature. And one of the most important poets of the 20th century,
Carmen.
So, Carmen, so like Gian Mario, I think that obviously I say, because that's exactly what I do, I write novels, but I'll talk about something that I know a lot about. So I feel the need to say perhaps the conventions shift with novels. Even already in the 30s, people thought, is it possible that novels will, people speak in inverted commas, with the use of inverted commas. Sometimes conventions change, they modify. For example, we live in a time when, in a very fragmented time, our own identities are very fragmented. How can we expect a coherent internal, a coherence internal to a novel when we don't have it in our own lives? So even the reader shouldn't expect that himself. A distinctive trait of a modern person is that, as a difference between their fathers and their grandparents, they already know where they're born, but they don't know where they're going to be buried. Whereas our parents and our grandparents, yeah, they bought the plot in the cemetery already before, or were buried with their family. Whereas we don't know this anymore. It isn't a given. So this return home, that contribution we heard earlier, was so imagination definitely returns home through novels, but it's not a return to this kind of Ithaca, a defined place, a definable place. Home can be even friendship, with languages, with friendship, as an expat or something. If novels kind of loosen themselves of the rules and the conventions that hold them back and adapt to this fragmentation of modern life, then maybe there's more hope for them to return to their original role. And to be brief here, and the original role of novels, there's a brief paragraph I'm going to read you from Mario Rigoni Sterni in this book here. I'll briefly read it. Mario Rigoni Sterni. He came back from Siago in the 50s, and they lived with ex-soldiers, and they opened a bookshop, all these ex-soldiers. So putting some of his own books in it as well. For example, people in the area, a very poor area, a place of inhabited by farmers mostly. So he says 2 or 3 hours every day I spent arranging the library of the ex-soldiers, which had thousands of volumes. So I'd take some wood home with me, and I'd light the fire, and there was a lot of books that talk about the First World War, but also novels, all kinds, from all different kinds of authors, and even a book about natural sciences and everything. The novels of the 800 Frenchmen were the most that came from the town were the most requested. So, given the chance to imagine it, when they brought them back, they already knew. At that time, obviously, there wasn't a TV or anything. Very few had radios, and people read more. On Sunday mornings after Mass, people would come into the library, even from distant towns. They'd pay 20 lire to borrow a book for 15 days. They'd pay. So what did it matter if when they gave it back, it smelt of cows and of farm life, and they were read either way. Sometimes read aloud to families during the winter, or even sometimes in stables while they were waiting for cows to give birth. So thank you for that. Gian Mario, so a very quick thing just about poetry. You said that writing a novel is like putting a message in a bottle, and even poetry's like that. It's like putting a message in a bottle, knowing that you've just let it go in the desert. So there's not very many places for it to float then, is there? So I also thank Carmen for having read this part of Vigori Stern that helps us remember an amazing thing about literature. It's this sense of home, this sense of finding yourself, that everywhere can be your own home, no matter where you are, because these poor farmers who return these books that they smelt of cows and cowpats, they still read these books, these stories of Russians, of Americans, of distant peoples. And this is kind of the message that I'd like to see. We should continue to read novels and look for, with our own curiosity, to push authors and editors to make things that make us curious. For me, one of the best feelings as an author is when it happens. Obviously, it doesn't happen all the time. Is when I manage to come across a writer who says the opposite of what I think, who writes in the way that's completely contrary to how I write, and because of that, in full honesty, I'm ready to sacrifice everything I do, to be honest, when faced with it. And this is an experience that it's amazing. It's like finding an older friend than you in places where you weren't looking for it at all. Sometimes maybe even in this desert where there's no rivers, there's no streams, but there are still little pieces of paper, pens and bottles. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us, both online and in person. Thank you very much.